The expression on her face when 50 gallons of pool water blasted out was beyond unforgettable. But let me not get ahead of myself, as this story starts a few weeks earlier. Roughly 3 weeks ago, I noticed something strange. My electricity bill had somehow doubled. After some digging, I discovered that Karen from the HOA board had been secretly tapping into my power supply every morning to run her absurdly loud, high-powered blender during her neighborhood rounds. Yes, the same woman who once fined me $350 because my trash cans were out 10 minutes past pickup time. The same person who reported me for having an unapproved garden gnome. Well, she chose the wrong electrical engineer to mess with. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, because you're about to hear the most gratifying HOA revenge story of all time. When I moved into Sunshine Meadows about 6 months ago, everything seemed fine at first. I had just gone through a divorce and was looking for a new beginning. I purchased this fixer-upper in what appeared to be a peaceful neighborhood. The house was structurally solid, just needed some updates, and with my background in electrical engineering, specifically in renewable energy systems, I figured I could handle it easily. My name is Liam Lopez, and until recently, I kept a low profile. I work from home as a solar panel system designer, spending most of my time in my home office or occasionally testing new equipment in my garage. I mind my own business. My first run-in with Bethany Anderson happened 2 weeks after I moved in. I was on my roof setting up a compact weather station well within my legal rights per county codessa when I heard a sharp, commanding voice from below. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" I looked down to see a woman in her late 50s dressed in a beige pantsuit, with a flawless blonde bob that barely moved in the wind. She clutched a clipboard like it was a badge of authority and tapped her foot on my driveway with growing impatience. I explained I was installing a weather station as part of my renewable energy studies. Her reply came quick and frosty: "Unauthorized exterior modifications are not permitted per HOA bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph 12. Take it down immediately or be fined." When I tried to explain that under NOAA federal guidelines, small scientific devices like that were exempt, she cut me off with a dismissive hand wave. "I've led this HOA for 8 years, young man. I know the rules far better than you ever will." The next morning, a bright pink notice was posted on my door with a $250 fine for an unapproved rooftop installation. That was only the beginning. A week later, I got slapped with another citation, this time for having a garage door painted in a non-compliant shade of brown. Never mind that it was the original color from when the home was built. I contested the claim with photographic proof, but Bethany showed up herself for an in-person review. She paced around my property with a color swatch book, holding it up to various parts of the house and muttering disapproving sounds. The HOA has since updated the list of approved colors, she informed me smugly. "You've got 30 days to repaint it." Repainting would run thousands of dollars, some money I didn't have after buying the home. The first clear sign that she was deliberately targeting me came via a pink slip in the mailbox. It read, "Violation. Lawn exceeds height limit by 0.5 inch. Fine, $100. I was furious, but I paid it. Then I immediately measured my grass. It was exactly 2.5 inches tall. The maximum allowed height stated in the HOA bylaws I had carefully reviewed. Then came another fine for an unauthorized mailbox design. The same mailbox that had been there since I moved in. Another $100 gone. Strangely, many homes had identical mailboxes, but none of them seemed to receive citations. The last straw was a fine for non-compliant vegetation. All I had were a few tomato plants in my backyard garden. That's when I realized I needed to dig deeper into what was really going on. I finally got a chance to speak with my neighbors, the Wilsons, who filled me in. We were standing on their front lawn watching a stern woman with a perfect bob measure someone's fence with a tape measure. "That's Bethany Anderson," Mr. Wilson whispered. "She's been the HOA president for 8 years. Her late husband helped develop half of this neighborhood back in the 90s. She's obsessed with rules." Wilson, a retired elementary school teacher who had lived there for 15 years, explained that Bethany had been slowly changing the community, especially targeting new residents. "She likes to make examples of them," he said. "The last family that pushed back ended up moving out after 6 months of her nonsense." As if she could sense we were talking about her, Bethany looked up, caught us watching, and made a theatrical note on her clipboard. The next morning, while reviewing data from my home's energy monitoring system, I noticed something odd. Every weekday between 7:30 and 8:15 a.m., there was a sharp spike in electricity usage, about 2.2 kilowatts. That's quite a lot, similar to what a small commercial appliance would consume. Luckily, I had a Fluke 1587 FC multimeter and had installed a smart energy system when I moved in. It's just second nature to me. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was pulling serious power during that narrow window, and only on weekdays. So I set up a discreet, weatherproof camera near my outdoor outlet. I hid it inside a bird feeder mounted on an oak tree just nearby. The footage I reviewed the next day left me stunned. There was Bethany Anderson, dressed in her ever-present beige suit, casually plugging in a high-end blender into my exterior power socket. While doing her morning rounds, she wheeled the blender in a cart, stopped at my outlet, whipped up a smoothie, and continued on her way like it was nothing. Her nerve was unbelievable. But what happened next was the tipping point. The video showed her finishing her smoothie, unplugging the blender, and casually walking over to my newly remodeled pool. She snapped a few pictures, scribbled in her notebook, and pulled out yet another pink violation slip. The camera zoomed in just enough to read the notice. Violation: excessive water usage for non-essential feature during conservation season. Fine, $275. There she was, writing me up while literally stealing electricity from me at that exact moment. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about power trips, control. And Bethany Anderson needed a serious wake-up call. Lucky for her, I'm an electrical engineer who knows a thing or two about systems and consequences. To prepare, I started asking around. Carl Thomas, a retired real estate attorney in his 70s who lived 3 doors down, invited me over for coffee when he heard I'd crossed paths with Bethany. His house was the only one in the neighborhood with bird feeders, something he'd won the right to keep after a tense legal standoff with the HOA. "You've stepped into a hornet's nest, son," he said, handing me a steaming mug in his sunroom. Bethany isn't just a power-hungry nuisance. This is a business for her. Carl explained that Sunshine Meadows had been built in 1989 as affordable housing for veterans and middle-class families. Bethany's late husband, Richard Anderson, had acquired much of the surrounding property in the early 2000s with dreams of redeveloping the area into luxury condos, but zoning laws stopped him. When he died 8 years ago, Bethany inherited a 40% stake in Anderson Development Group, now run by her son-in-law, Joseph Bennett. Their long-term play: push out original homeowners through overzealous HOA enforcement, stacking up fines and fees until people were forced to sell or default. Then they'd swoop in and buy the properties dirt cheap through shell companies. Carl pulled out a thick binder of evidence: meeting minutes, newsletters, and carefully logged infractions. They schedule elections when working families can't attend, misrecord votes, approve new assessments with barely any notice. And the enforcement? Completely selective. He showed me side-by-side photos, identical violations on 2 houses. One got fined, the other owned by one of Bethany's friends that didn't. "I've been documenting all of it," Carl said. "But most people are too scared or too broke to fight back." Last year, 5 families lost their homes, all bought by entities linked to Anderson Development. I was stunned. This wasn't petty tyranny. It was a strategic land grab. "Has no one reported this?" I asked. Carl sighed. "HOAs operate in a legal gray area. They have a lot of discretion. Most violations are too minor to sue over, and by the time people realize they're being cornered, they're drowning in fees." Then he leaned in and whispered, "She's been doing this for years. Half the board's in her pocket. No one's ever stopped her." I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Well, Carl," I said, "she's never gone up against someone who knows electrical systems and fluid mechanics. I think it's time for a little science experiment." We spent the next hour combing through HOA bylaws, identifying leverage points, and planning how I could legally shield myself. Carl warned me, "Be careful, son. Bethany doesn't fight fair and she has resources you don't." "I'm not planning anything illegal," I assured him, "just a broken bar creative." As I walked home, I noticed a figure watching from a second-story window. Gladys Perry, Carl had told me, the neighborhood's longest-standing resident at 68. She gave me a slow, knowing nod. That evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No name, no return address. Inside was a handwritten journal. 5 years of Bethany's inspection records the dates, times, notes, and violations. The last page had today's date, and a short message: "We're watching too. Good luck." The next few days, things escalated. Bethany must have sensed I was planning something. Suddenly, my mailbox was 1 inch too high, my house trim was the wrong shade of white, my lawn still a 1/4 inch too tall. The fines came fast to $100 here, $300 there. She was trying to drown me in citations. But I'm not easily drowned. I'm an engineer. I solve problems. So I started thinking like one. Define the problem, identify constraints, brainstorm solutions, analyze trade-offs, implement the optimal plan. The problem: she was stealing my electricity and abusing her position. Constraints: I had to stay legal. My response had to be proportional, no harm, no excessive damage. And it had to be deniable. As I started sketching out systems and scenarios in my notebook, I wasn't just planning a countermeasure, I was planning a reckoning. I started to ask myself some hard questions. Was I becoming the very thing I hated? Was I stooping to Bethany's level by planning revenge even if it felt justified? My ex-wife's voice echoed in my mind. "Liam, you always think you can engineer your way out of human problems." She used to say that a lot. That memory gave me pause. Our divorce had partly stemmed from my habit of treating emotional situations like technical puzzles. Was I repeating the same mistake? But this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about a neighborhood being systematically squeezed for profit. I'd spent 6 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before going civilian designing power systems for forward operating bases. Those systems had to be efficient and tamper-proof. One design we used relied on load-sensing tech that detected electrical theft and automatically shut off compromised circuits. That military training, paired with my current experience in renewable energy, gave me a unique lens to view what Bethany was doing. In the Army, I learned that confrontation required strategy. My old Major Harrison, always emphasized proportional response. "You're not just fixing a problem," he'd say, "you're showing who you are." I realized my solution needed to reflect that: smart, controlled, and not cruel. So, I began designing a response that combined my engineering background with basic fluid dynamics. The idea was simple. If someone used my outdoor power outlet without permission, it would trigger a modified drain valve from my pool system, sending a harmless but memorable splash of water their way. It wouldn't harm anyone or damage property, just enough of a surprise to deter future theft. I got to work. I mapped out schematics, calculated water pressure, accounted for electrical loads, and added fail-safe mechanisms. The system had to tell the difference between my tools and Bethany's coffee machine. Using power signatures and electrical fingerprints of different devices, I could program it to react only to unauthorized usage. The water system had to be effective but safe, with no electrical hazards. I needed materials and maybe a second opinion, so I headed to the local hardware store. That's where I met Hulda Taylor. She was around 50. A former mechanical engineer now working retail after being laid off from the auto industry. When I mentioned I was reworking my pool system, her curiosity was piqued. "You live in Sunshine Meadows, right?" she asked, steering me toward a quiet aisle. When I confirmed, she leaned in. "Ho, trouble?" I nodded. "Bethany?" Another nod. Her expression darkened. "Back room, 5 minutes. I might have something for you." The store's back room smelled like fertilizer and paint. Alda shut the door behind us and pulled out her phone. She showed me dozens of violation notices, photos of petty infractions stacked over 2 years. "I ran for the board last year thinking I could change things from the inside." "Big mistake," she said. "Most decisions," she explained, were made before meetings even happened, through private conversations with Bethany's circle. When Alda asked questions about the HOA's budget discrepancies, she was threatened. They tried to use a technicality, a supposed zoning violation tied to the small jewelry business she ran from home, to silence her. "I used to design aerospace components," she said, her voice caught between pride and disappointment. 22 years at Preston Aerospace, until everything got outsourced. Now she sold hardware supplies by day and crafted intricate metal jewelry at night to make ends meet. She showed me some of her work, delicate, precise pieces that blended engineering finesse with artistic skill. Bethany knows my home business is technically against code, but several board members' wives buy my pieces. It wasn't a problem until I asked about the budget. Alda had tried to reform the board, but she'd been outmaneuvered and pressured into compliance. Still, she hadn't given up entirely. "They're planning something big," she whispered. "Bethany's son-in-law, Joseph, needs at least 12 more properties cleared this year for some development deal." She showed me a draft of proposed regulation changes, seasonal planting requirements, parking restrictions targeting work trucks, mandatory repainting every 3 years using only A-approved contractors. "It's designed to force out working families," she said. "The new fines will start at $500 per violation, with daily compounding penalties for non-compliance." The revelations only fueled my determination. As I continued collecting components, I ran into Kyle Fremana, a local pool technician who'd overheard parts of my conversation with Alda. He approached and offered his help, mentioning that he too had clashed with the HOA while trying to run his small business. The three of us, Alda, Kyle, and Dia, collaborated on a system that was both effective and legally sound. Kyle, whose father had built half the pools in the neighborhood back in the 90s, had watched their family business grow to employ 8 people. His expression darkened as he explained how things had unraveled. Then Bethany started pushing A-approved vendors only. Suddenly, we weren't on the list anymore. 30 years of experience had gone overnight. Now, it was just him, barely keeping things afloat, while Magic Waters Pool Service, owned by Bethany's nephew, got every HOA referral. Before putting anything into motion, I consulted Detective Nightmore, a local officer and former military man, for a legal check. He reviewed my setup thoroughly and assured me it was within my rights. "As long as the water pressure isn't excessive and there's no property damage, you're good," he said. "Just document everything, including the theft itself." As I turned to leave, he stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. "Off the record," he said, glancing around, "my parents lost their retirement home in Oklahoma State to a similar HOA power play 3 years ago. I couldn't do anything back then. Sometimes the system is too slow for justice." His eyes told me everything. He understood what was at stake. With that silent encouragement, I moved forward. The engineering challenge was as engaging as it was important. The system had to be safe, selective, effective, and completely defensible under the law. I began by installing a commercial-grade current transformer around the hot wire feeding the outdoor outlet, that fed into a custom analog-to-digital converter, capable of sampling power usage 50 times per second. The data ran into a Raspberry Pi 4 running a machine learning algorithm I'd trained to recognize specific electrical signatures. Bethany's espresso machine had a distinct inrush current when its heating element kicked in, followed by rhythmic fluctuations from the pump, totally different from my lawn gear or power tools. When the system identified that pattern, it triggered a relay system controlling a modified irrigation valve. I calculated the water pressure carefully enough for a jarring surprise, but well within safe limits. The system would only engage after confirming 30 seconds of unauthorized use. Additional fail-safes prevented harm and limited water output. To hide the setup, I built a fake rock landscape feature near the outlet, complete with embedded cameras to record every angle of any incident. The entire process from wiring to testing took 3 intense days of late-night work. I checked every connection 3 times. It was flawless. Now, all I had to do was wait. I set my alarm for 6:30 the next morning, restless and tense. From my home office, blinds half drawn, I had a clear view of the outlet. My monitors displayed all the camera feeds. My phone was in hand, ready to record any moment the fixed cameras missed. At exactly 7:35, Bethany arrived, a silver Mercedes SUV gliding to a stop across the street. On schedule, as always, she stepped out in her usual beige pantsuit, clipboard tucked under one arm, and her smoothie cart in tow. She made a show of inspecting my neighbor's yard first, snapping pictures of some invisible offense. Then, casually, she crossed onto my property. She parked her cart beside my outlet, plugged in her top-shelf blender, and started making her morning smoothie, completely unaware that justice was about to be served cold and wet. Part of me wanted to storm outside and confront her directly to force her to acknowledge her hypocrisy and face the damage she'd done to our community. But another part, the one that remembered every smug smile, every unjust fine, every life she'd quietly wrecked, wanted to savor this moment of reckoning. So I stayed hidden, eyes fixed on the system indicators as they lit up. Her blender had triggered the unique power signature detection. This wasn't just about stolen electricity anymore. This was about control. About standing up to abuse of power in all its forms. As soon as the system confirmed the unauthorized usage, a 3-second delay kicked in just as I had programmed. Then, with perfect precision, the modified valve released a forceful jet of pool water from a concealed spout near the outlet. Bethany, engrossed in her smoothie prep, didn't notice the water until it hit her square inches the back, soaking her perfectly tailored pantsuit and splashing directly into her high-end blender. A sharp sizzle followed, and the machine powered down in a puff of smoke. She screamed loud enough to wake the whole block, then stumbled, slipped on the wet grass, and landed hard on her backside. The blender sparked a final time before dying completely. While Bethany sat there drenched and livid, my cameras captured every glorious second, including the moment she looked straight at my house, eyes filled with fury. I ducked behind the curtain instinctively. "I know you did this," she shrieked, scrambling to her feet. "This is assault. This is destruction of property." She stomped toward my front door, dripping wet and leaving muddy footprints across my freshly cut lawn. But I was ready. I activated my front door's two-way speaker. "Good morning, Mrs. Anderson," I said evenly. "Is there a problem with your unauthorized use of my electricity?" "The system is automated to deter theft, the same kind of system I once designed for military installations overseas." The mention of military experience wasn't accidental. It was meant to imply I had backing and technical credibility she couldn't push around. Her face twisted in fury. "You think this little stunt is going to stop me? I'll have you fined into oblivion. I'll have you arrested." She jabbed a soaked finger at the camera. Droplets flew from her hair. "For what, exactly?" I asked, still calm. "You're on camera, stealing electricity from my property, a Class B misdemeanor in this state." My automated system responded with a non-lethal water deterrent. "I think the police would find the footage very informative." For a split second, her expression wavered, and uncertainty flickering behind her rage. Maybe, for the first time, Bethany realized she'd crossed someone who wouldn't cave. 15 minutes later, a patrol cruiser rolled up. Officer Trent Jackson, a well-respected 35-year-old known for his level-headed approach, stepped out. Bethany, now wrapped in an emergency blanket despite the warm morning sun, flailed dramatically, demanding my arrest. I welcomed Officer Jackson inside, offered him coffee, and showed him everything of video footage, power usage logs, documentation of my anti-theft system. He listened intently. "Let me get this straight," he said, clearly holding back a smirk. "She's been stealing your power during HOA rounds to make smoothies, and your system only activates when someone uses your outlet without permission?" I nodded. "Uses pool water, harmless, all on my property." He replayed the footage, especially the part where she was writing me a violation ticket while siphoning my power. Officer Jackson walked back to Bethany, and while I couldn't hear their conversation, her wild gestures contrasted sharply with his calm demeanor. As the discussion dragged on, his stance stiffened, his head shook more firmly. At one point, he even glanced back at my house, clearly incredulous. Eventually, he returned. "Mrs. Anderson wants to press charges for assault," he said, then shrugged. "But I've explained that no crime has been committed on your part. Unauthorized utility use, however, is theft." He paused and then added with a subtle smile, "I suggested she have her blender professionally inspected before using it again. Water damage can be unpredictable." He handed me his card and advised I document all future interactions with the HOA. As he walked back to his cruiser, Bethany stood by her car, glaring at my house like it had personally betrayed her. I couldn't hear what she told Officer Jackson, but I saw him point toward the outlet and then at her ruined blender before calmly getting into his car and driving off. Before Officer Jackson got into his vehicle, He appeared to be explaining something to Bethany, something she clearly didn't want to hear, judging by her increasingly frantic gestures. When he finally drove off, she stood frozen for nearly a full minute, eyes locked on my house. But her expression wasn't just fury, it was calculation. I recognized that look from my military service. It was the face of someone who hadn't expected a fight, but was now determined to win it. That afternoon, I got a call from Darren Hawkins, Bethany's insurance investigator. He asked for footage of the incident. After reviewing everything, he promptly denied her claim for the $3,200 blender, citing negligence and her own contributing actions. By evening, word had spread through the neighborhood. The Wilsons sent over a fruit basket. Gladys Perry called to say she'd caught the entire episode from her upstairs window and proudly added it to her Bethany Chronicles. Even Alda, who rarely texted, sent a simple FY apostrophe from an anonymous number. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I walked out to find all 4 of my car tires slashed. A handwritten note was tucked under the wiper. "This isn't over." Bethany had just escalated things. Our dispute was no longer a disagreement, it was war. The tire slashing was just the opening salvo. Over the next 2 weeks, Bethany weaponized the HOA's full authority against me. Anonymous complaints began flooding in, and noise violations during times I wasn't even home. Accusations of hosting unapproved gatherings when I had a single friend over, and claims that my home-based consulting business violated zoning laws. Each complaint required documentation, responses, appeals, eating up countless hours of my time. The HOA board, conveniently led by Bethany, began daily inspections of my property. They found infractions as minor as a slightly leaning garden gnome. The fines stacked up fast to nearly $2,000 within 10 days. But Bethany had miscalculated. In trying to isolate me, she inadvertently unified a community she'd long oppressed. Her overreach sparked quiet resistance. The Wilsons began logging HOA inspections, noting which homes were targeted and which were mysteriously untouched. Gladys Perry recruited other retired neighbors to photograph every house, building an archive of selective enforcement. Kyle Freeman, the neighborhood pool technician, quietly spread the story among clients, many of whom had their own Bethany horror stories. Late one evening, a quiet knock on my back door startled me. I checked the security feed and found Mrs. Wilson standing there, nervously glancing over her shoulder. She stepped inside and whispered, "A few of us have been meeting secretly at Carl's place." She admitted they'd all been afraid for years, but watching someone finally stand up to Bethany had inspired them. She told me how Bethany had actively discouraged neighborhood gatherings, and even targeted her family when they fought to keep their son's basketball hoop. In retaliation, neighbors were hit with noise complaints. Eventually, they removed the hoop to protect others. That moment clarified everything for me. This wasn't about fences or landscaping or technical violations. Bethany was tearing families apart under the guise of maintaining property values. Soon after, I met Howard, a retired accountant, at a remote coffee shop. He passed me a manila envelope across the table. "I've been an accountant for 35 years, he said softly. "I know fraudulent bookkeeping when I see it." Inside were financial records from the HOA. Special assessments were missing from reports. Maintenance contracts included suspicious kickbacks. Fines were underreported, officially logged at half the amount collected. I asked why he was risking so much. "My wife has Parkinson's," he said. "We moved here because the single-level homes worked for her. But then the board mandated a safety upgrade, so handrails and ramps that had to come from specific vendors, at triple the going rate. I checked. The supplier is Bethany's brother-in-law. She's profiting off my wife's disability." Then came Grace Wilson's story, a 78-year-old retired nurse. She lost her home not long after her husband passed away. Her daughter Jennifer showed me stacks of violation notices, driveway cracks, mismatched curtains, even improper mailbox upkeep. Dad handled all the maintenance, Jennifer said. Mom was grieving. Every time she fixed one thing, they'd hit her with 3 more violations. The final straw, her rose gardenia roses she'd grown for 20 years was suddenly deemed non-compliant. Then, during a drought, water restrictions made it impossible for her to meet landscaping requirements. The stress triggered her heart condition. While she was hospitalized, The fines piled up until the HOA placed a lien on her house. That night, we had our first official meeting in Carl's basement. It felt like a resistance cell gathering in secret. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years were finally forming a united front. Each person brought something to the table. Harold Pierce, a retired postal worker, described how his grandkids were banned from visiting after Bethany deemed his backyard unsafe for children. Wilson created a secure communication system. Kyle's access to backyards across the neighborhood gave us intel. Alda's tech skills made sense of the HOA's digital records. And Carla quiet, methodical Carla was a retired attorney. He began outlining a case. Together, we weren't just fighting back, we were building a movement. From a quiet newcomer, I'd become an unlikely leader, an awkward, unfamiliar role, but a deeply rewarding one. For the first time since my divorce, I felt connected to something greater than myself. As our investigation gained momentum, Bethany must have sensed the noose tightening. Her actions grew erratic. I began receiving letters threatening property liens over unpaid fines. Then came anonymous calls to city code enforcement about violations that didn't exist. Someone even contacted my employer, falsely accusing me of moonlighting in violation of my contract. Thankfully, my boss saw through the lie and gave me a heads up. Just as we were compiling the final pieces of our evidence, a text came through from Wilson. Emergency home meeting tomorrow. 7 p.m. Special assessment vote at $2,000 per household for new security cameras. B says it's due to recent vandalism. This is about you. They weren't trying to protect the neighborhood. They were trying to bankrupt me out of it. But they had made a critical misstep. The meeting was set for 7 p.m. at the community center, a time when working residents could actually attend. Unlike Bethany's usual midday power plays, this one would have an audience. I arrived early with Carl and was surprised to see nearly every household represented. Bethany sat smugly at the front table with Joseph Bennett and 3 other board members. Alda was among them, barely meeting my eyes. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this night with precision. Inside my laptop bag was a hidden server running a covert network, disguised as the community center's Wi-Fi. When Bethany connected, it would intercept her presentation, capture her admin credentials, and swap in our evidence here automatically. Everything would stream to my laptop, ready for public release if she tried to shut down the projector. But tech was only half the plan. The last 48 hours had been a frenzy of secret coordination. Carl activated his network of longtime residents, of people who'd kept quiet out of fear. Howard Jenkins brought clear, annotated spreadsheets tracing missing funds and kickbacks. Gladys Berry condensed 5 years of meticulous notes into a damning timeline of selective enforcement. Jennifer flew in from Arizona with her mother Grace's medical files, proving the emotional toll Bethany had inflicted. Carl and I guided key speakers to seats near microphones. Those with particularly emotional stories were positioned where cameras would catch their reactions. 3 local reporters had slipped in as guests of residents unknown to Bethany, but ready to document the fallout. Officer Jackson arrived in plain clothes. So did Detective Moore. They took opposite sides of the room, prepared to intervene if things escalated. The room was tense when Bethany banged the gavel at exactly 7 p.m. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We are facing a serious security threat in our community." She launched into her presentation, citing vague criminal activity and outside influences threatening Sunshine Meadows. Though she didn't name me, it was obvious I was the target. "This individual has installed unauthorized water systems, repeatedly violated HOA rules, and created a hostile environment for our officers." I scanned the crowd. A few residents nodded along, her loyalists, likely newer homeowners who didn't know the full story. Others looked uncomfortable, caught between doubt and fear. Those who knew the truth kept their faces unreadable. Then Joseph Bennett took the floor. He laid out the proposed security solution: a 24-hour surveillance across the neighborhood, with particular focus on so-called problem areas, namely my home. "This is an unfortunate but necessary expense," he said, "to maintain our community standards and preserve property values." He motioned to a folder. "We've prepared documentation justifying this measure." But something was off. Joseph's voice lacked Bethany's certainty. His eyes flicked nervously around the room. He kept checking his watch. Carl had told me what that meant: Someone was cracking under pressure. Carl had trained me well. Joseph's starting eyes, fidgeting hands, and constant watch-checking were all classic tells of deception. But even more revealing was the behavior of the other board members. Two leaned in with interest, clearly buying into the narrative that I was a threat. But Alda and a man named Douglas sat stiffly, eyes locked on their papers, never once looking up. Their body language screamed discomfort at people who knew they were being fed lies but weren't ready to confront them. Then the floor opened for public comments. Bethany's plants jumped up immediately. The first was a realtor who had brokered several sales for her allies. She warned about the dangerous precedent of homeowners bypassing the HOA. Next came a contractor who, I would later discover, had been granted multiple maintenance contracts by the board. He spoke ominously about vigilante behavior eroding community safety, just as the tide seemed to be turning against me, just as Bethany had planned at a Carl rouse. The room quieted immediately. His presence carried weight. Before we vote on any special assessment, he said calmly, shouldn't we review the specific evidence of these so-called violations? HOA bylaws require documentation for any emergency assessment exceeding $500 per household. Bethany's mask faltered for a split second before she recovered. Of course, she said, rising with practiced poise. She connected her laptop to the projector. I've prepared photographic evidence of the violations and hostile conduct that have brought us to this point. She entered her password and opened the file, and then she froze. The screen didn't show her slides. It showed mine. First, a time-stamped video of her plugging an espresso machine into my outdoor outlet at her daily theft of electricity laid bare. Then the footage transitioned automatically. Spreadsheets revealing misappropriated HOA funds, photos comparing selective rule enforcement, and damning email threads exposing her links to companies buying foreclosed homes in our neighborhood. Finally, the smoking gun, a written conversation between Bethany and Joseph, planning a campaign to transition out the undesirable LESA code for original homeowners to clear space for a lucrative redevelopment deal. The room exploded. Years of buried frustration surged to the surface as neighbor after neighbor stood up to speak. Grace Wilson's daughter, who had flown in just for this moment, tearfully recounted how Bethany's harassment led to her mother's hospitalization and eventual forced move. Howard Jenkins stood and confirmed the financial irregularities with cold precision. 3 more residents told stories of being intimidated, fined into submission, or pushed out only to have their homes bought by Anderson Development. And then came the quiet voices that shook the room the most. Martha Donovan, a kindergarten teacher who'd kept to herself, rose with trembling hands. 3 years ago, Bethany threatened to report my home daycare when I questioned a fee increase, she said, her voice cracking. I've been silent ever since, afraid to lose my livelihood, but not anymore. Then Harold and Judith Pierce, a retired couple who'd lived in the community since it was built, stepped forward. They held a worn shoebox filled with violation notices, 173 in all. Some of these are for having leaves on the lawn, Harold said, voice unsteady. We've paid over $20,000 in fines. That was our retirement travel fund. We haven't seen our grandchildren in 3 years. But perhaps the most unexpected voice came from Darren Collins, the community's newest resident and a successful real estate investor. Many had assumed he supported Bethany's vision. I've flipped homes in 30 neighborhoods, he said, standing tall. And I've never seen anything like this. This isn't oversight, it's organized extortion. The atmosphere shifted. The anger became unity. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years exchanged phone numbers. Plans were made. Support was offered. The walls Bethany had spent years building between us collapsed in a single night. Meanwhile, Joseph sat frozen, his carefully built persona unraveling as the weight of the evidence settled on him. Alda and Douglas quietly scooted their chairs away from Bethany, as if afraid of catching the fallout from her corruption. And then, in a final unexpected moment, the community center's janitor approached Officer Jackson. He quietly introduced himself as a former paralegal and said, I've been watching these meetings for 4 years. I think you are going to want my notes. Bethany's face shifted through a rapid sequence of emotions: shock, rage, and then a cold, calculating expression. I could practically see the wheels turning in her mind as she scrambled to find a way out of this mess, to discredit the evidence or shift the blame. But when that failed, Her frustration boiled over. She lunged toward the computer. That's when Officer Jackson, who I had called in to maintain order, stepped between her and the screen. "I think this conversation will need to continue down at the station," he said firmly, as the room went silent. As they led her out, she locked eyes with me. If looks could kill, I'd have been 6 feet under. But I knew this wasn't over, and not by a long shot. The aftermath of that meeting was swift and wide-reaching. Officer Jackson and Detective Moore opened a formal investigation into financial fraud. Based on the records Howard provided and the other evidence we'd gathered, Bethany and 3 board members were forced to resign pending investigation, and Joseph Bennett found himself under scrutiny for improper land deals. Anderson Development Group's stock took a nosedive when the news broke. The legal fallout was just as severe. The district attorney filed multiple fraud charges against Bethany and Joseph. Forensic accountants uncovered over $800,000 siphoned from the HOA accounts, with nearly $2 million in offshore kickbacks. The IRS joined the investigation, revealing years of tax evasion. 6 months later, Bethany accepted a plea deal on multiple counts, which required her to forfeit her assets, make full restitution to affected homeowners, and serve a 40-month federal prison sentence. The court also established a restitution fund that allowed displaced homeowners to repurchase their properties at original prices. The state attorney general seized the opportunity to launch broader investigations into HOA practices statewide, resulting in new legislation aimed at ensuring financial transparency and stronger protections for homeowners. A special audit uncovered years of financial mismanagement. The remaining board members called for emergency elections, and Carl Thomas was elected temporary HOA president. His mandate was clear: reform the bylaws and establish transparent governance. I put my technical skills to work and created a digital portal where residents could track HOA decisions, financial transactions, and rule enforcement in real time. We also set up a community review committee to ensure fair and consistent application of rules, eliminating the petty tyranny that had defined Bethany's leadership. Assessment fees were reduced by 30%, yet services improved by cutting out corrupt contractors and kickback schemes. The most heartwarming change came 3 months later when Grace Wilson returned to the neighborhood. With the help of a legal fund set up by residents, she challenged the foreclosure on her home, which was overturned when evidence of Bethany's harassment came to light. Grace moved back into her family home, tears of joy in her eyes, welcomed by neighbors who had finally found their voice and community spirit. Sunshine Meadows began to transform. Restrictive landscaping rules were replaced with community garden initiatives, which Grace took charge of. Reasonable property standards were maintained without harsh enforcement. Alda, who had once been one of Bethany's staunchest supporters, led a new energy efficiency committee, working alongside me to install solar panels for interested residents at discounted rates. The United Neighbors, a group that had secretly formed to challenge Bethany, became an official community organization. They hosted quarterly events that brought the neighborhood closer, building bonds between both old and new residents. Bethany's legal troubles didn't stop there. The investigation into her HOA schemes expanded to include charges of tax evasion, and Joseph Bennett faced securities fraud charges for misleading investors about the development project. Anderson Development Group was forced to divest its interest in the neighborhood under a settlement agreement, which prohibited any future development in the area. 6 months after that pivotal meeting, I was up on my roof installing solar panels fully approved under our new sensible guideline when I saw a moving truck pull up in front of Bethany's house. She had been forced to sell after the investigation exposed years of tax evasion tied to her schemes. As her luxury furniture was loaded into storage, I couldn't resist. I watched her standing by her car, glaring up at me. I smiled and waved, then casually plugged my power drill into my own outlet. Sometimes, justice isn't just served cold. Sometimes, it's electrifying. The story of Sunshine Meadows spread far beyond our neighborhood. It inspired other communities to take a hard look at their HOA practices and confront corrupt leadership. Carl and I were invited to speak at local community meetings, sharing our story on how to establish transparent governance and protect homeowner rights. The digital portal I created was adapted for use in several other neighborhoods, forming a network of communities committed to fair housing practices. A week ago, I received a letter from a national homeowners advocacy group asking permission to use our case as a teaching example in their training materials. Apparently, the video of Bethany getting drenched by my pool water had become a bit of a legend in HOA circles, a warning to overzealous board members everywhere. As for me, I finally finished renovating my house. It now boasts a state-of-the-art solar system that not only powers my home but also feeds excess energy back to the grid. My outdoor outlet has a small plaque that reads, "Free power for neighbors in need, just ask first," and it's never been used without permission since. In this neighborhood, karma always clocks in.